Be kind. Be soft. Be someone people can count on. That's what they told you. They didn't teach you strategy. They taught you sacrifice. Not as a tactic, but as a personality. They said, be the one who shows up early, who stays late, who never says no, who never asks for anything in return. And you listened. You made yourself available, present, loyal, constant. You thought that made you irreplaceable, but it made you invisible. Because here's what no one warned you. People don't value what's always within reach. They use it, and then they resent it. You became the one who texted first, who answered fast, who forgave before they apologized. And the more consistent you became, the less they noticed you at all. That wasn't kindness, that was surrender. But you told yourself it was noble, that being overlooked was part of being selfless, that being used was just proof of your strength. You were wrong. Machiavelli wouldn't call it compassion. He'd call it a mistake. A fatal one, because in a world that runs on perception, being too available is the fastest way to be completely ignored. The more you gave, the less they listened. That's the part no one warns you about. You didn't become their rock. You became their rug, not because you weren't valuable, but because you didn't understand that value has to be controlled, not offered freely. You were available at any hour, for any reason, and they used you, not always out of malice, but out of comfort. And comfort? It turns presence into background noise. They stopped asking how you felt. They assumed you were fine. They stopped showing up for you. They assumed you'd survive. They stopped thanking you, because they assumed you'd stay. And all the while, you called it patience, compassion, loyalty. But what it really was a slow erosion of your presence. You became expected, not appreciated. A fixture, a utility, a default setting. You thought love meant showing up no matter what. But respect is born from restraint, from absence, from the fear of losing someone, not the comfort of always having them. Machiavelli would have seen it clearly. He'd say, a prince must never be too accessible, because what's always available becomes ordinary, and what's ordinary is never feared. You weren't disrespected because you were kind. You were disrespected because you made your kindness predictable. You thought showing up made you stronger. But what it did was make your presence routine. A kindness that was once powerful became just expected. And expectation kills meaning. People don't question what's always there. They don't protect it. They don't fear its loss. They adapt to it like background music. They start to talk over it. Forget it was even playing. You gave them everything you could, your time, your silence, your patience, your loyalty. But when effort becomes constant, it fades into the walls. Even the most beautiful painting disappears when it hangs in the same hallway long enough. They didn't reject your kindness. They just stopped noticing it. And that's where power ends, not with confrontation, but with erosion. Quiet, slow erosion. Machiavelli understood perception. He knew that power must be seen, not simply given. Projected, not begged for. He warned against being overly familiar, because the familiar becomes forgotten. If you're always within reach, you're never truly held. And what's never held is never truly respected. You thought availability meant love. That if you were always reachable, always responsive, always ready, they would feel safe. They would feel grateful. But availability without boundaries doesn't create admiration. It creates dependency. And dependency eventually turns into neglect. You became easy to reach, easy to interrupt, easy to ignore. Your name popped up on their screen. And they didn't flinch because they already knew what you'd say, how you'd respond, what you'd forgive, how little they'd have to give in return. And that predictability didn't make you secure. It made you irrelevant. Machiavelli never told us to be cruel, but he warned us never to be too known. Because power fades when people can predict your every move. when they've read all your pages before you've even spoken. You gave them the full blueprint, your triggers, your weaknesses, your softness. You believed it built trust, but it dismantled your advantage, not because they were evil, but because humans use what's fully accessible. That's why mystery matters. That's why silence is strategy. You feared being misunderstood, but the greater risk was being fully understood and completely dismissed. Power doesn't live in exposure. It lives in restraint. People don't follow what they fully understand. They follow what they admire, and admiration is built on distance. You wanted to be liked, so you made yourself accessible, present, open, ready. But likability is cheap. It's given quickly, forgotten quicker. What lasts, what shapes perception, is restraint, because respect requires space. Think about the people you've truly admired. They weren't the ones who replied instantly, who explained themselves constantly. They were the ones who made you wait, made you wonder, made you question your place in their orbit. And that uncertainty? It kept your attention sharp, your curiosity alive. Machiavelli understood this better than most. He knew that power doesn't come from exposure. It comes from unpredictability, from emotional delay, from being just far enough to be chased. You gave them your rhythm, your replies, your reactions, and with each one, they mapped you like a city they no longer feared getting lost in. But power dies when you become a routine, when your behavior becomes an open book. If they can define you, they can dismiss you. If they always know where you are, they forget why they should miss you. You weren't abandoned. You were decoded, and then quietly replaced. Disappearance is not weakness. It's precision. It's presence. By absence, you've been told to stay available, to stay present, to stay seen. But constant presence creates one thing: emotional inflation. The more they see you, the more they expect you. The more they expect you, the less they register you. Until you're not a person, just part of the background. You weren't supposed to be always available. You were supposed to have weight, and weight requires contrast. When you disappear with intent, you're not vanishing. You're creating silence sharp enough to echo. You're building tension, authority, value. Machiavelli understood this. He warned, a leader who is always visible becomes ordinary, and what is ordinary no longer inspires fear or loyalty or respect. So no, this isn't withdrawal. It's choreography. You step back not to leave, but to re-enter with consequence. Let them wonder. Let them search. Let them feel your absence before they're ever allowed to feel your return. Because silence, when chosen deliberately, commands more power than 1,000 words spoken constantly. And when you come back, they'll notice, because this time you weren't expected. You were missed. You think people need to understand you in order to respect you. But clarity doesn't always earn reverence. Sometimes clarity earns control, because the more they understand you, the easier it is to manage you, to decode you, to use you. When people can predict your reactions, they stop preparing for them. They stop listening. They stop watching. Predictability isn't intimacy. It's exposure without defense. It's the slow death of authority. You believed openness made you human, that explaining your thoughts, your fears, your doubts would make them trust you. But what it really did was make you readable, and the readable can be rewritten. Machiavelli warned against transparency, not because truth is weakness, but because information is leverage. And once you give it away, it no longer belongs to you. They learn your pace, your tone, your emotional timing, and then they preempt it, or worse, weaponize it. You thought being understood was connection, but true connection doesn't require access. It requires tension, mystery, uncertainty. They shouldn't always know what you think. They should wonder. And that wondering is where influence begins. Because mystery doesn't confuse power. It protects it. You think saying more gives you control, that words create clarity, that clarity builds trust. But power doesn't come from how much you speak. It comes from what you withhold. Silence isn't absence, it's architecture, a deliberate gap where your presence becomes felt, not just heard. When you explain everything, people stop paying attention. When you justify yourself often, they start expecting an explanation. And when you speak without limit, your voice becomes background. Machiavelli understood this well. He didn't write about volume. He wrote about timing. He believed in controlled silence because unpredictability creates respect, and scarcity builds weight. Speech is currency, and the more freely you spend it, the less it's worth. You gain respect not by filling the room, but by owning the moment you choose to break the silence. When your words feel earned, not expected. Let them talk over each other. Let them flood the space with explanations. You speak when the room needs direction, not distraction, because when they can't anticipate what you'll say, they'll listen harder. And when you pause instead of respond, they'll wonder if you're calculating something they missed. Silence isn't retreat. It's signal. And the fewer words you use, the more they study every one. Predictability makes you safe, but it also makes you disposable. They know how you'll react. They know what you'll tolerate. They know how far you'll bend before you break. And once people know your range, you stop being respected and start being managed. You gave them your rhythm. Now they dance around it. You gave them your script. Now they skip ahead to the ending. Machiavelli saw this with perfect clarity. He wrote, "The predictable leader is the weakest figure in any room, not because they lack strength, but because they lack surprise. If they can guess your next move, they don't need to fear you. They just need to prepare. And when people are prepared, they're emboldened. Power doesn't come from consistency. It comes from unpredictability, from being unreadable, untouchable, unmapped. They should hesitate before crossing you, not because you're loud, but because you're unknown. When people don't know how you'll react, they walk slower. They watch closer. They adjust. Uncertainty breeds caution. Caution creates respect. So don't be the one they can forecast. Be the anomaly, the exception, the threat they can't pin down. Because what they can't predict, they can't control. And what they can't control, they learn to respect. Closeness without boundaries is corrosion. It doesn't build connection. It erodes presence. It dissolves weight. You thought staying close made you dependable. That constant presence built loyalty. But the truth is, proximity kills perception. The more they have access to you, the less they register your existence. You stop being someone they notice. You start becoming part of the background. You were never meant to be always available. You were meant to be missed. Machiavelli warned of this. He believed that rulers who made themselves too familiar lost their edge. Because overexposure doesn't create trust, it creates disregard. You were there for everything, every message, every favor, every moment of need. And slowly, they stopped valuing it, because it was always there. What's abundant becomes assumed, and what's assumed becomes invisible. They didn't walk away because you lacked value. They walked away because you lacked distance, because you gave them everything before they ever had to earn it. Scarcity forces awareness. Absence sharpens memory. Power isn't in how often you appear, but in what changes when you don't. Withdraw intentionally. Let them feel the contrast. Let your absence create a silence they can't fill. Because once you stop being everywhere, you finally become somewhere that matters. Power is not loud. It's not reactive. It doesn't need to be declared to be understood. True power is restraint. It's the calm that unsettles a chaotic room. It's the silence that forces others to explain themselves. You thought reacting proved you cared, that showing your anger made you authentic, that emotional transparency built trust. But in reality, Emotional exposure creates openings, not connection. Openings for manipulation, for misinterpretation, for strategic attack. Every time you lost your temper, they learned your edge. Every time you explained too much, they memorized your insecurity. Every time you defended yourself in haste, you gave them the keys to control you later. Machiavelli never praised passion. He praised precision. He taught that those who stay composed while others unravel quietly inherit the room. Your emotions are not weapons. They are leverage, and when given too freely, they cease to be useful. Self-control isn't coldness. It's discipline. It's refusing to hand your nervous system to someone else. Be the one who observes when others overreact, who measures before responding, who withholds when provoked, because the one who cannot be emotionally hijacked cannot be quietly removed, and the one who can't be shaken makes everyone else tremble. You were taught to communicate, to express your feelings, to explain your thoughts, to be honest, to be open, to be clear, but no one told you that information is currency, and giving too much away is how people learn to spend you. Every time you overshare, you dilute your mystery. Every time you explain without being asked, you lower your perceived authority. Every time you speak just to avoid silence, you surrender the tension that could have worked in your favor. The strongest people in the room aren't the ones who speak first. They're the ones who speak last, when it matters, when it shifts the tone, when the room needs anchoring. Machiavelli mastered this. He believed a ruler's voice was only powerful when it came after everyone else had already spoken, and failed. That restraint wasn't timidity, but a form of control. Let them wonder. Let them guess. Let them question your silence more than they ever questioned your speech. Control isn't just about what you say. It's about what you refuse to say, what you let them project, what you let them fear. A little ambiguity is unsettling, and that unsettling feeling is often mistaken for power. Because when they can't read you, they'll tread lightly. And when they tread lightly, you don't even have to raise your voice. You don't need to be present to be powerful. In fact, the most powerful people are often the least accessible, not because they're avoiding anyone, but because they understand the weight of distance. You thought staying close kept you relevant. That constant presence meant permanent connection, but closeness without scarcity breeds forgetfulness. Because the human mind stops noticing what it sees all the time. Familiarity doesn't build respect. It dulls it. The more they see you, the more they expect you. The more they expect you, the less they value your presence. Until your presence becomes noise. Your power isn't in being seen. It's in being noticed when absent. Machiavelli wrote that absence strengthens dignity, that scarcity sharpens memory, that distance recenters authority. So disappear, not in silence, but in strategy. Withdraw not to punish, but to let the frame collapse so they can realize you were the structure. Let them feel the shift. Let the room sag without you. Let your withdrawal reteach them what your presence once prevented. Because when you vanish intentionally, you don't fade. You echo. And when they start to remember you instead of rely on you, you've already taken back the power they forgot you held. They didn't forget you because you were unworthy. They forgot you because you were always there, always ready, always answering, always available. You stood in every gap, carried every silence, filled every moment that wasn't yours to fix. You said yes before they asked. You anticipated needs before they were voiced. You gave before they earned. And they accepted without noticing. And slowly, you stopped being a person. You became function, expected, automatic, quietly taken for granted. Not because you weren't enough, but because you never allowed yourself to be missed. Machiavelli warned, what is always accessible loses its value. What is always seen becomes invisible, and what is never missed is quietly replaced. So pull back, not to punish, but to reframe. Let the gap open. Let the quiet grow uncomfortable. Let your absence stretch long enough that they feel the structure bending without you. They'll wonder why it feels different. They'll wonder what changed. They'll wonder why they can't reach you the way they used to. And that wondering, that's the beginning of respect. Because once your absence teaches them what presence never could, you'll never have to explain your worth again. You were never weak. You were never irrelevant. You were simply too accessible, too predictable, too constant, too easy to reach, and far too easy to forget. But now you know. You've seen how proximity can erase presence, how overexposure can dissolve power, and how being endlessly available quietly teaches others to stop looking at you altogether. Now you understand. Power isn't volume. It's gravity. It's the weight of your absence, the sharpness of your silence, the question mark you leave behind instead of the answer you always offered. You've spent enough time proving yourself. Now it's time to withhold yourself, not in bitterness, but in discipline. Machiavelli never glorified cruelty. He glorified clarity. And clarity means knowing this. You do not owe the world your accessibility. You owe it your standard. So walk away for a while. Let them wonder where you went. Let the silence stretch long enough to teach them something. And when you return, do not return the same. Speak less, stand taller, move slower, mean more. Because now you're no longer just good. You're remembered, not for how often you showed up, but for how deeply they felt your absence. Be good, but never be available. That's how they'll never forget you.